Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, I had the pleasure of sitting down with award-winning director and producer Robin Hauser to talk about her most recent documentary, Savvy, which explores why it's critical for women to understand and take control of their personal finances. During the show, we discussed the main obstacles for women to take control of their finances, why women typically outperform men with investing, and why negotiation skills are essential for women to embrace as it relates to the financial plan. Before we jump into the show, I recognize that many listeners may not be aware of what the team at YFP Planning does in working one-on-one with more than 250 households in 50 plus states. YFP Planning offers fee-only high-touch financial planning that is customized to the pharmacy professional. If you're interested in learning more about how working one-on-one with a certified financial planner may help you achieve your financial goals, you can book a free discovery call at yfpplanning.com. Whether or not YFP Planning's financial planning services are a good fit for you, know that we appreciate your support of this podcast and our mission to help pharmacists achieve financial freedom. Okay, let's jump into my interview with Robin Hauser. Well, I'm really excited to welcome on this week's podcast Robin Hauser, who's the award-winning director and producer of documentaries Code, Debugging the Gender Gap, Bias, Savvy, Running for Jim, made to illuminate causes about which she is passionate. Those include the gender gap in tech, unconscious bias, equality, and financial savviness. Robin's work has carried her around the world, from the TED and TEDx stage to the White House, NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and conferences worldwide, speaking about mitigating bias in artificial intelligence, the likability dilemma, diversity, inclusion, financial wellness, and gender equality. A self-described disruptor, Robin is committed to provoking thought to address the most important socioeconomic issues that we face today. Robin, welcome to the YFP podcast.
Thanks, Tim. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really excited to have you on the show and to dig into the documentary that you helped produce, Savvy. And this came from a friend of mine who let me know about the documentary. And I'm so glad that she did, because I think it's going to be an incredible resource for the YFP community and of course, for pharmacists and others even beyond. I want to start with a story, Robin, that you shared in your 2019 TED Talk that we'll link to in the show notes. That TED Talk was called The Likability Dilemma for Women Leaders. And you share a story when you were on the ski resort and a man approached you and asked you if you were with a husband or a fiance. And you said no and started to head back toward the lift. And your curiosity got the better part of you. And you decided that you were going to follow up and have a conversation. Take us there and tell us what happened at that moment.
Right. This is such a good example to me of sort of unconscious bias, right? So I'm walking through the ski resort. I've got a pair of skis on my shoulder. And this man, he was young, probably late 20s, early 30s, just came up to me and said, "Hey, excuse me, are you with a fiance or a husband?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, okay." Sort of like, okay, never mind. So I kept walking and I thought, wait, I got to find out why he asked me that. So I turned around and walked back to him and I said, "Hey, I'm just curious, just wondering why you asked me if I was, with a man." And he said, "Oh, because we're selling timeshares." And that gave me pause. And then I looked at him and I said, "So, and you don't sell to women?" And he said, oh, yeah, well, we could. Yeah. Are you interested? And I said, "Well, no, not really." But I said, "You do know that women have pocketbooks too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like women can buy condos or can join a timeshare, but it was as though it had never occurred to him. And poor guy, he's just trying to do his job. But I think that it's that the way they trained him was sort of to go for probably the average, which is find couples that are together, heterosexual couples, and, ask the guy, because usually it's the man handling the purse strings and making sort of long-term or investment decisions. And it just really struck me that they were missing this entire sort of demographic by not actually, approaching women.
And you shared another story in that same TEDx talk where you had a cocktail party and you asked the man about his line of business, and he said he was in the fintech business. And he said, what type? And he said, "Well, it's complicated." And I think it's just another example of what you just mentioned there. And my question for you is, why do we men often carry this implicit bias that women don't understand finance or they're not involved in the finances. Where does that come from?
Well, and I just want to point out that these are likely very, well-intended men.
Mm-hmm.
And when this man said to me, "Oh, it's complicated," he did definitely say it in sort of a dismissive way. And what I was curious about is, had I been a man, had he said that to me? Would he still have said, "Oh, it's complicated," or would he have said, "Well, actually, we're a white bank and we're raising, 10 million for our first fund," or whatever, right? And gone into details about it. But he was just assumed, and maybe it's because I'm a woman, maybe it's because I'm blonde, I don't know. But he just made this assumption that it would be probably too complicated. And
Mm-hmm.
my response to him was, try me. Like, you might be surprised. I actually might be able to understand you, and the concept, of whatever your fintech deal is. A lot of it is stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's really interesting that in um, our society sort of dictates that finance is male territory. And if you look back over the years, that's how it's been. So even if a woman handles the lunch money or the day-to-day, grocery money, it doesn't mean that she's involved in long-term financial planning. It doesn't mean that she's necessarily involved in how much are you saving, who's your mortgage with, what sort of debt do you even have? I mean, these are questions she might not be able to answer.
Yeah, and just a point of vulnerability here for a moment. My wife and I had this conversation not too long ago where just what you said there. So my wife stays home. We've got 4 boys. Just phase of life we're in. She day to day is spending money on the groceries, activities, homeschooling things. She has a much closer look on the financials day to day than I do. But long term planning, I was really taking a lot of that under my wing, and we really identified this disconnect between the long term planning and what was happening day to day. And we said, really, if anything, like you should be in charge and empowered in the financial plan. Obviously, we both need to be involved, but I think that's a very common thing that can happen. And we really felt like it was a great moment to take a step back and say, sure, there's the issues where if something were to happen to one of us, do we both make sure we have a good understanding of the whole plan? But just objectively, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, especially in the phase that we're in, it just makes sense, that she would really be taking the lead and what we're working on financially.
Well, that's right. And when you think about, look, we're all really busy, right?
Yeah.
So divisional labor in a partnership, in a marriage, is important. You don't both need to always take the
Mm-hmm.
kids to school. You don't both need to, walk the dog together. I mean, if you can, that's wonderful and that's fabulous. But the reality is that we all take on a lot. And so we need to divide and conquer at times to be most efficient. My point is, that's not what we need to do with money. With money, when it comes to money and planning money and understanding personal finance, it's something that we need to at least collaborate on, once a month so that we know. And that's exactly right. As you said, here are the reasons that women are so vulnerable. Number one, we live longer than men. So
Mm-hmm.
even if you live a full life, chances are that a woman's going to live 8 years at the end of her life on her own. We earn less money because we spend more time out of the workforce. Therefore, we have less Social Security. And we earn less. We earn 80 cents to the dollar that a man makes.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is why 80% of women 65 and older live in poverty, 80% more than men, right?
Yeah.
That's astounding. I mean, that's a problem. So we women need to get involved with personal finance, take the reins of their money, and really understand, how to grow their wealth, and so that if they did or when they do end up on their own, they'll be able to handle it.
Which is a great call to action. Our community, as I mentioned before we hit record, the pharmacy profession is predominantly has more women than men, especially as of late with graduates over the last 20 years. So such a good call to action and reinforcement for our community. So the Savvy documentary addresses why women across the board often take a passive role or give up their role in managing their finances. And you say particularly in millennials. And obviously there's many factors as to why. But what do you feel like is the greatest obstacle or two for women being able to take control of their finances?
Probably intimidation. I think what happens is that, I mean, the financial industry was built by men for men, not on purpose to exclude women. It's just that's the way it was when Wall
Mm,
Street was being created, It was men that was handling that organized that, right?
Hmm.
And so along with that comes this sense of sort of ambient belonging, right? Using a lot of acronyms, ETFs, your SEP, your IRA, what do these things mean? And even very well educated, very intelligent women can feel marginalized and can feel intimidated if they haven't kept up and if they don't understand.
Hmm.
And especially now with technology and the way fintech is working, there's all sorts. I mean, cryptocurrency. There's all sorts of new terminologies, and it takes effort to keep up with what does this all mean,
Hmm.
right? And so I think that's probably the biggest hurdle is this intimidation factor, thinking, oh boy, I really should have kept up with this all these years and I haven't. And so, now I'm behind and I don't even know. It's overwhelming. I don't know how to catch up. I don't even know how to start, right? And often the woman who is busy with kids and probably her own job and volunteer hours and everything else doesn't make the time to go to the financial planner with her spouse.
Mm.
And therefore, she doesn't really have a great relationship with that person. 90% of women who are widowed or divorced change financial planners or advisors within the first year. And what
Wow.
does that tell you? That tells you that women are not relating
Yeah.
to the financial advisor, or the financial advisor doesn't really understand the plights or the issues
Yeah.
that women face when it comes to money, and they're not really working to maintain their female clients.
Yeah, and perhaps weren't invested in that relationship together or a part of the decision making for that relationship to begin with. And it's one of the reasons when we're talking with individuals that are looking for planning services, and if it's a situation where it's a spouse or a significant other, but folks are doing that together, both parties need to be present from Jump Street. Now, as time goes on, it may be that schedules get busy and maybe it's not realistic that for every single meeting, two people are always there. But upfront decision making, understanding the goals, the priorities, the issues, so important to have both individuals that are involved. So, one of the things that you highlight in the documentary that I thought was fascinating is the statistic that when women invest, whether that's hedge fund managers, mutual fund managers, or individually, they outperform men by about 1% annually. And when I saw that, we preach and teach on this podcast that 1% really matters. Our listeners know that in terms of the compound effect of 1% over time, whether that's in returns or perhaps fees or a combination of both. So when I see 1%, like that matters. That's significant. Why is this? What's behind this? Tell us more.
Yeah, I think it's one basis point a year, which corresponds to about 1%. And I think what that is women are more risk aware. They're not more risk adverse. They're more risk aware. So
Mm.
women understand the risks involved in investing. They might put a little bit more attention into being well diversified, to not jump into something that sounds like it's a really good investment, but could have a huge negative impact on a portfolio if it were to go wrong. So because of that, because of women's patience and their sensibilities to risk, they tend to make better investment decisions.
Yeah, and that of course compounds, over time. But we know when you look at simulations of portfolios, if you're able to mitigate, the volatility of a portfolio, but take on appropriate risks in the long term, you're going to see really good returns. So that makes sense, to me. The other aspect that I've seen in my own situation, but a pharmacist I talk with all across the country, and the men that are pharmacists that listen may not like me calling them out, but there tends to be a little bit more overconfidence that I see in terms of, certainly there's varying levels of education, but is there an openness and a receptiveness to learn and to have someone come alongside of you to be able to advise, but also to keep you accountability? And I know that's a big generalization, of course, but I think there's a different level of receptiveness that may come to that as well.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean that there's a confidence gap when it comes to women and to girls. This is just something that we tend to suffer from,
Hmm.
right? So there have been some really interesting studies. I think Catalyst did a study several years ago, that showed 10 different qualifications that you would need, whether you're a woman or a man, to apply for a job.
Mm-hmm.
And men tended to apply with confidence if they had, even just 60% of the qualifications, right?
Mm-hmm.
And women, even who had 100% of the qualifications, still were not 100% confident that they would get the job or that they qualified for the job. So there's a big difference in our, and physiologically. Is that because of testosterone? Maybe. But what it says is that we need to push ourselves as women. We need to push ourselves to become more confident, to take that, to take on investing, to decide that we're going to take that promotion in order to stay sort of with the on a good career trajectory, because otherwise I don't know that we'll ever feel 100% confident that we're ready for that next step.
Yeah.
But when we do take it, we perform well, right? So it's just a matter of feeling confident and understanding that we can take that risk.
Yeah, and as you challenge the women to lean into that confidence and be comfortable taking some of that risk, I would challenge the men listening to really ask themselves, am I perhaps overconfident, in the financial plan, or what are the opportunities for learning and improvement and perhaps a different perspective as well? Robin, you also touch on in the film negotiation skills, a topic we've talked about in this podcast before, specifically around credit card negotiation, salary negotiation. Why is this so important for women to develop and refine? And why do you think it's something that many women may shy away from?
Well, I think we shy away from it because of the confidence gap, what we just talked about. But negotiating is a really interesting thing, because what happens is that when women and men negotiate, when we negotiate, women tend to outperform men in negotiations, but only when women are negotiating on behalf of somebody else. When we negotiate for ourselves, we are not as successful. So why is that? Well, it's because in our society, women are supposed to be, especially, a good woman, right, is supposed to be supportive, deferential. We are not necessarily rewarded when we come across as overly confident, overly assertive, decisive, right? What those are things that men actually are rewarded for, because they are seen as leadership skills in men more than they are in women, right? And this comes into this sort of likability dilemma. But when it comes to negotiating, it's fascinating because women appear to be, we violate societal norms of what it is to be a likable woman when we are negotiating hard for ourselves. We come across as being selfish and self-centered and maybe even greedy, right? which is kind of ridiculous, but those qualities we tend to tolerate more in men and expect more of in men than in women. So what does that mean? Women have to often come to the table and negotiate and give examples of why they need money, which is interesting. So why they would need a higher salary. And those are things that men aren't burdened with as much. And I think that if you're an employer, I think, we need to pay attention to this. We need to understand, if you want to retain women, if you want women to rise in your company, we need to, one, push them to take promotions, and two, understand that it's going to be harder for her to ask for a salary raise, even though she earns it and has earned it and deserves it, right? And so we need to be aware of that. And we need to also be aware of the fact that women know how we're perceived when we negotiate. So we are careful about how we negotiate and what we do. And the reason we need to continue to negotiate successfully regardless is because otherwise the pay gap widens.
Yep. And that's where my mind was just going, Robin, with the pay gap is, and I appreciate the call to action to the employers that are listening. So important to be aware of it and to be taking action appropriately, especially in a field like pharmacy where, we have great flexibility where pharmacists may, through different seasons of life, cut back hours or increase and then take back hours over time, depending on family needs and other needs, which is a great benefit, but also can be a challenge if you're stepping out and into the workforce to make sure that pay, differential is not widening over time. And so I think, the responsibility certainly lies in part on the employer, also in the individual to be able to effectively negotiate for themselves and to be confident in doing that. So it's a great piece. We often on this show talk about the lack of financial literacy available to pharmacists while they're in pharmacy school. And I know financial literacy education is a big topic, one I'm passionate about, that really should start as early as possible and be as longitudinal as possible. And this is really striking for our profession, where we have new graduates coming out on average with about $170,000 in student loan debt. And because of the lack of financial literacy of education, I think it's easy to make missteps along the way. And so my question here is, were there any key lessons that you took away from the documentary or in the preparation of the documentary that really focuses on helping to improve financial literacy among women, even if it's access or interest? How do we overall rise the level of financial literacy and education, and make it one that is accessible, of interest, and also is able to be action oriented?
Well, and this is for men and women, right? We
Yep.
need to have financial education courses, relatable financial education courses in school and in high school, even. I mean, I'm even a proponent for starting them age appropriately in grade school, but there's no reason that you can't learn in high school the positive and negative impacts of compounding interest, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You need to understand that that you need a credit card. First of all, you need a credit card in order to establish good credit. And in fact, when you get to college and you're going to rent an apartment, they're going to check your credit score. So you need to establish a credit score by having a credit card, and yet paying off the minimum. Nobody teaches us how to use credit cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless happen to have parents that
Yeah.
teach us these things. But otherwise, everybody that comes out of school, comes out of pharmacist training in school, gets maybe 3 different credit card invitations a month.
At least.
But yeah, at least, if not a
Yeah.
week, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
ridiculous. And yet, in any of those, unless you're going to, even if you read the fine print, does anybody stop and say, but here, let me actually teach you how to use this?
Mm-hmm.
Because paying the minimum is not enough. Paying the minimum means you're actually going to be paying interest, right?
Yeah.
Interest is
A lot of
accruing.
interest. Yeah.
A lot of interest. Yeah. Some of those
Yeah.
credit cards, those initial credit cards are over 25%. So that's
Yeah.
huge. So I think that's essential for men and for women. We need to know what our credit score is. We need to pay off the total balance on a credit card every single month. We need to use less than 10% usage of it in order to have the highest credit score rating.
Mm-hmm.
But these are things that nobody teaches us, right? So I think that's important. And then I also think that, yes, whether you're in business school, whether you're coming out of pharmaceutical school, we need to have. There's no reason that there can't be an a finance course that's specific to your industry, right? I
Yeah.
think that's something that we're owed, especially if you're going to end up with $170,000 in student loan debt.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see momentum among this, and I think there's other health professions I would give kudos to. I think medicine has done this well from an association college standpoint. Veterinary medicine has done this well from an association college standpoint. And I think what we need to get past is the stigma and the idea that this is a doctorate level education and personal finance doesn't belong. It does belong, right? Because we know the connection between financial wellness and one's ability to be a clinician and to work effectively in their role. Those things are very well connected. And so I think we're starting to see momentum in our profession around this topic, which is very exciting. And of course, for folks that are listening that have, kids at home, what a great opportunity to just begin conversations as early as you possibly can. And these come up all the time if you watch and listen for them. I remember being with my oldest son, who's now about to be 11, probably when he was 5, maybe 6, and we were at the grocery store, and he just asked me a question once at checkout. He was like, "Oh, so Dad, like you just swipe the card and then you get the groceries? Like, is that how it works? You just swipe the card and you get what you need?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, what a great teaching moment about, how does money go from work into a bank account? There's not physical cash, right? This is such an incredible learning moment, but that is a foreign concept if a child gets money from a gift or from work and it ends up online, but I don't see it in front of me, but it's in an account. Like, what is that? Right? What does that mean? So I think just such a great opportunity to be having these conversations, if we're in a position to do that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And the psychology, behind all that too, right? Like if we
Hmm.
are just swiping, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how your son would react if you had pulled out your wallet and paid in cash, which none of us do anymore, for the
Hmm.
groceries as opposed to swiping that card, right? And there's something that they talk about called the pain of paying. And I
Hmm.
think that's really interesting because it is much less painful to pay with a credit card. It's more painful when we see our balance at the end of the month and we have to say, okay, pay that off.
Hmm.
But in terms of sort of swiping versus taking out a few 20s or 50s from our wallet, that kind of hits us a little bit more in terms
Yeah.
of the pain. And let me tell you, I mean, with Venmo, what's
Oh my
Venmo? I mean,
gosh.
that it's crazy, right? There's just sort of
Hmm.
this fictitious balance. I mean, it is a balance actually, but you almost forget that it's tied to your checking account, and
Yeah.
and there seems to be no pain in that at all, which is why it's so easy to spend.
Yeah, one of the things my boys will often ask me now, and I guess I'm glad that they're comfortable asking the question, but they'll often ask, well, how much does that cost you, Dad? How much does that cost you? And sometimes their reaction is like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Or like, oh, that's not bad. And I'm like, well, it's still, a lot of money, and let's have a conversation about kind of work. But you also don't want to create a scarcity mindset. And so there's a delicate balance, as you're having these conversations with kids about money, but there's things they can relate to, right? So if they get $1 or $3 or whatever the tooth fairy pays nowadays for a tooth, like they understand what that is. So if they can understand, something costs $20 or $50, that might, really resonate with them and be able to put their arms around exactly, what is the amount of something. And to your comment about, the pain of paying, like it becomes real when they can really see the tangible dollars that are at play. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is it feels like to me there's a significant inequality of who is leading the financial education out there. And, one of the reasons I was so glad to see this documentary specifically geared towards empowering women around money, and obviously the work that you've done here, is it feels like if you look at the traditional education around financial topics, it is largely led by men. Now, I think that's shifting. What's happening, but let me give one example. I'm kind of going down the rabbit hole right now of learning about cryptocurrency. One, because it's a topic I feel like I've got a baseline knowledge in, but as we get more questions, I want to myself become more knowledgeable. And I'm digesting YouTube videos and blogs and books, and I'm pretty far into the journey, and I can maybe think of on one hand, if even that many women that are leading the conversation and the education around cryptocurrency. And while that's one example, I think it sheds light into other areas of the finances, whether we're talking about the alphabet soup of retirement planning or estate planning or tax planning. It feels so heavy on the male side of the equation as it relates to financial education literacy. Am I reading that correctly?
Well, yeah, I think so, because I mean, there are many more male financial advisors than there are women. This is something that, there's a big effort to change and trying to get more women
Hmm.
into financial advising. But I think especially when it comes to crypto, and why? Well, because crypto is sort of a merge of finance, which we know is male oriented, and computer science, which is male
Mm.
oriented. So when you're taking two things that tend to that have the stereotype to be very male centric, I think it stands to reason that there are
Mhm.
less women there. And
Mhm.
again, back to that idea of ambient belonging. I mean, if you just don't feel like you belong there, if it doesn't feel like home when so if a woman goes to a cryptocurrency conference and there she's one of the only or the few women there, she's going to feel like she doesn't belong, right?
Yeah.
So it's really hard to pioneer and to push through that, being the minority, and many women have. Same goes for people of color, right?
Mhm. Yep. That's right.
Um, but I do think that it's hard to be what you can't see, and so we need to get more women into finance and into crypto, into computer science,
Mhm.
sciences in general. I love hearing that pharmaceuticals is
Mhm.
strong, has a strong hold of women. That's fabulous. But this is what we need to do in order to change the stereotype.
Well, this is great, Robin. I really appreciate the conversation, and I would encourage folks to make sure that they check out the documentary Savvy. We'll link to it in the show notes. Where is the best place that folks can go to learn more about you and to follow the journey and the work that you're doing?
Well, finishlinefeaturefilms.com is our website, and we will list different screenings of Savvy that whether it's film festivals or whether we're doing public screenings, you'll find them listed there. So keep an eye on that website.
Awesome. We'll link to that in the show notes. So thank you so much, Robin, for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim.
As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.